Visiting with the commissioner of the Wyoming High School Activities Association, Ron Laird's on the phone with me. And Ron, thanks so much for taking some time out of your busy day. Let's talk about the latest Wyoming High School Activities Association Board of Directors meeting on Tuesday of this week. Big ticket item has been softball. I remember I had you on my morning show in Laramie about a year ago this time, maybe a little bit less than that. We started the conversation about softball, where it was at, and all of a sudden here we are about a year later, and it's going to become reality. What's the conversation been like across the state in some of the district meetings and some of the things you've heard, Ron?
Well, I think schools, now that we have we have a rule that you have to have at least 8 schools commit, and as of last week, Cheyenne approved it also, so we're up to 11, and there's a potential maybe 12th school too. So I think that was the key, is that we just had to get it going. I think it reminds me very much of when we first started soccer. That's about what we started with, was 12 schools, and now we're up to 23 that starting next year that'll be playing soccer. And so I can see the same type of thing happening with softball. As years go by, I would see some of the other 3A schools and the 4A schools that aren't interested right now or don't think they have the numbers. I could see that continuing to grow as we put it in.
As you looked at what happened with the board, were you surprised that it passed unanimously, or did you feel like that was going to be the case going in?
I think, we have discussed it a lot for the last year and a half at the board level and at the district level. We just wanted to keep everybody, up to date as far as where we were at each time, because we had some schools that committed early, and then we had others that were, in discussions, and we were trying not to put any pressure on the schools as far as a timeline, so that they could, each one were looking at different things, and they could go ahead and make sure that they had their ducks in a row, and that they had looked at everything that they felt like they needed to look at their local level. And so once that we got the 8th school going, then we've already preliminarily met with all of the 12 schools, just in case they're all there, and have started looking at what this will look like next year. It will be our first year, the spring of 21.
Why the 22-game limit? I've heard a little bit of discussion about that. I've heard some proposals in different areas maybe trying to bump that up. Why the 22-game limit?
Well, we're hoping we can get 22 games in the spring, to be honest with you.
That's true, yeah.
But, if we have the 12, it would probably break out into 6 and 6. And so in softball, kind of like Legion baseball, it's common to play a doubleheader when you go, you're going to make those trips. So you would play a doubleheader when you're playing your home and homes. So with your conference games, that's going to give you 20 of your 22 right there. And then we would have one tournament that we would allow, kind of like we do in volleyball and basketball. They might get 4 games in that tournament, but it would only count as 2 towards the 22-game limit. And the idea with the first of those doubleheaders in the conference games would count, and then the second one would be, to let the other kids play and that type of thing, so it wouldn't count. But it would also give the flexibility of, if you and I were supposed to play at my place and we did get rained out, and we weren't able to make it up right away, when I came down to your place, we could go ahead and have both of those doubleheader games count as a conference game, and that would help with some of the travel, so that we're not scrambling that last week and a half trying to get 10 more games in or that type of thing. So we just felt that was a good starting point. We're going to go ahead and mirror, as of right now. We had a lot of discussion on that with the season. We are going to start with mirror the track and soccer seasons with when they start the practices and when the state tournaments will be. And those 2 items there probably took the longest time, as far as, and a lot of good discussion on those types of things. We did put in a 3-game-a-day limit, so that we try and protect kids a little bit as well. And so I think we're off to a good start. We've looked and talked to a lot of the other states that have had this in place for a while, and took some of the advice of issues they've run into, especially Montana and Idaho being similar to us, both doing it in the spring and a lot of times having similar weather that we do. And how do you guys handle that? And that's pretty common. The 20 to 22 games seems to be pretty common with most state associations in our area anyway.
Was there any thought or conversation about possibly getting teams to travel to one kind of destination each of the weekends to make it maybe a little easier on travel, and then try and get in multiple games in a weekend?
Those discussions are what's going to take place next. We didn't. We just kind of threw out ideas on scheduling, but they also, they all want to make sure they get some home games as well. And so those will be, as we start looking here in November, we're actually, because we know it's going to take us longer with the first scheduling meeting, we're not going to include it in our scheduling meeting in November that we do with all the other sports. We'll bring those softball schools back at a different time after that, and be able to sit down and have a whole day type of thing to be able to just focus on the softball.
One of the biggest questions that we've received at Wyopreps, and I kind of get some of the conversation, but I also understand the point of having it in the spring. Why, in the end, did the board, do you feel, decided spring is best, and maybe why not going summer, but still trying to sanction it, I guess?
Well, we had that discussion when we were looking at when do we start. We talked about, do we start later and go into the summer? The concerns became, if you remember a few years ago, we did go ahead and we went soccer a week later than track, just to see if we could split that up a little bit and try and give each one of them their own weekend. And with graduations, it created a lot of issues. Some of the schools weren't comfortable with the fact that their kids had already graduated, and quote, do they have the same control over them they had when they were still students, and so we just had a lot of negative feedback, and that's why we've moved it back to there. But that was the first thing that I threw out is, do we want to look at that? Could we do it? Would it be possible? Some of the communities were concerned if they did that now we are cutting into more and more of the club, and would those girls that play a lot of club, would they maybe not play the high school then, and then would we have enough numbers to have a team since we were cutting into their season? And those types of discussions went on. So we felt, at least to start with, we would go with what we've decided on. That doesn't mean down the road it might not change once we've had some experiences with it. And as far as the spring, we really, the fact, again, with as many surrounding states as we have, we've got states doing both. Some do it in the fall and some do it in the spring. But we have 5 state championships right now for the girls in the fall. And so by adding a third one for the girls in the spring, it just made more sense in trying to provide more opportunities for girls. And so that was the crux of the decision.
Well, and you talk about the opportunities in terms of, creating more opportunities for the girls. Some would argue, though, that this takes away from track and soccer, and I know you've probably had those conversations. What are your thoughts on adding it to a place where there is a lot of girls that do participate in track and soccer already in the spring?
Yeah, and the other side of that was, if we put it in the fall, we've got a lot of volleyball girls and softball girls as well. Yep. And so I don't, unless we just go in and totally revamp all of when our girls' sports are, and maybe down the road we would have to look at that. But we're hoping that there'll be a few track and soccer girls that maybe go to. We're hoping the idea behind this is that we'll have 20 or 30 more girls from each of those schools doing something in the spring that weren't doing anything. And if that's the case, then we've accomplished our goal of increasing those opportunities for more girls.
We're visiting with Wyoming High School Activities Association Commissioner Ron Laird here, and talk a little bit about, I know we've got some other big news. One of the things is you have approved, and we knew 9-man football was coming. It'll be in place a year from now, and they'll be in their season. But 14 teams, were you surprised at how that shook out in terms of the number of teams and where the balance and cutoff lines are between 6-man, 9-man, and those that are going to be in 2A, including some of the smaller schools that are opting up to 2A, Ron?
Not really. We had, done a preliminary survey last year when we were still in the process of considering whether we were going to go to 9-man or not. And this is pretty close to where we were at. We might have 1 or 2 schools more than what we thought at that time. But we weren't sure, one, where the cut line was going to be, so that a school like Southeast, for example, they actually, by our cut line, come in as a 6-man school, but they've opted up to play 9-man. But in the past, they've always been above that 6-man. So we had kind of counted them as a 9-man anyway, and then it turned out with their enrollments, they did come down just below that line, but they're going to opt up. And so the one good thing that just kind of by chance, I think, happened in football, scheduling is a real challenge if you have an odd number of schools. And so we now, by having 14 9-man, that puts us at 16 then in the 2A. And so that's going to help both of those categories or either classifications, I guess, as far as being able to schedule Our odd man is the 6-man now. We have 13 there. But they do and have been at least able to find, some of our bigger schools are willing to play them with their freshmen or JVs or, that type of thing and get it, at least pick up a game and be able to fill a schedule, where the larger schools, the more you go up the ladder, I guess it makes it more difficult because those out-of-state opportunities aren't there as much as they used to be in the past.
Do you like how things are dividing up for the future of high school football in terms of just the number of teams within each classification overall, Ron?
Well, I'm certainly hoping that by going to this 9-man, that it builds some of the programs back up again, because that just seems to be the place that we're struggling the most with is in those smaller schools. They just keep getting smaller, unfortunately, and so those numbers of trying to keep a football program have really been a challenge. So yeah, I think for a first year, we're pretty pleased that there's 14 of them sitting there, and we'll see how that shakes out as we go down the next few years.
I know that there were some other things that the board talked about on Tuesday between regional wrestling seating criteria, some swimming and diving. I know there's a proposal for soccer, but really the other big one was 4A state golf. Looks like they're going to be changing some things in terms of what they do moving forward, and that passed on the second reading, so this will take effect next fall. So it sounds like, what exactly was the idea behind this or principle behind this?
Well, the idea was they just felt like they had too many golfers out on the course, and so this is a qualifying procedure now that they're going to put into place. And now that we've passed and approved the qualifying format, the 4AADs will now get together and decide what that's going to look like. But basically, they're going to have whether it's east, west, or north, south. I don't know that yet because they're going to work through that. But we'll have two conferences basically, and so the top 20 individual scoring golfers at each conference tournament will advance to the state, plus the top 4 teams. Now, obviously, a lot of those top 20 kids will also be on those 4 teams, but any other kids on those 4 teams that were not in the top 20 finishers will still, because they're on the top 4 team, will be allowed to go. So it's going to eliminate not a ton, but it is going to take probably 10, 15 golfers off of the course, which really does help those courses, and it helps our rounds speed up a little bit, and we're not playing into the dark and those types of things.
Yeah, I certainly understand that. And it sounds like this was something the coaches were in favor of.
They really have been for actually several years. It's just been some of the proposals they've come with before. They've talked about maybe having a qualifying score, and then that sounded like a good idea until they really started figuring out, how are we going to really determine that? And then they had another proposal that they looked at a different way to try and limit the number of golfers. I think this one is their best proposal that they've come forward with. I think it makes the most sense, and now I'm sure there'll be some bugs in it as they work through it, but I think this will be a positive thing for 4A golf.
Lastly, and I kind of brought this up just a few minutes ago, but the proposal for soccer, looking to take it from 14 to 16 games. I know every once in a while there's been discussion about the amount of contests within a regular season for a variety of sports.
Sure.
I can think about, whether it's football or basketball or whatever it might be. This one passes on the first reading. You'll come back and talk about it in November, but how I guess realistic is this about maybe moving from 14 to 16 matches?
Well, it was probably one of our longest discussions, to be honest with you, because out of our 4 districts, two passed it and 2 defeated it, and there are pluses and minuses with it. And it's kind of a 4A 3A thing, to be honest with you, because 4A schedules are set right now. By the time they play their home and home conference games, they get the one tournament. They have no flexibility in their schedules. What's happening with our 3A schools is they're not always able to even get the 14 games because of the distances and the travel that they have in between their particular schools. So they're hoping if they went to 16, it would give them a little more flexibility to get some help from maybe, and I'll use Buffalo as an example. They've got Sheridan and the Gillettes, kind of right there in that area, to where that would help them fill their schedule, plus it would help reduce. But then, depending on what part of the state you're in, it's not going to help the other ones, and it could end up hurting them because maybe now they're playing Buffalo and they don't get to play Buffalo, and now they don't have a full schedule. So that's been the discussion, is going back and forth on which way is best. So we passed it at this point because it was a first reading, and we want to take it back out and hammer through some of those other discussions that are still going on.
And it sounds like November, in addition to the board meeting, plus the state scheduling meeting and everything else that goes on, going to be a very busy month for you and the board.
Yeah, this time of year we're humping pretty good already. We've already had state golf and state tennis, and away we go. So it's a fun time of year though for the kids.
Ron, thanks so much for the time. I greatly appreciate it.
Thanks, Dave.